I want to welcome you all. For the record, I'm Professor Wallace, and I'm chairman of the International Law Institute. This is one in a series of programs that Yona has been putting on over the months. Rita has been involved in many of them. Yona asked whether the rule of law is still relevant. Well, Yona is not a lawyer. That word still has to be struck. Considering what we're facing and the enormous number of attempted human responses to it, that is the realm of law. You know, how the human society copes with problems, and we'll get into that. But I will say no more. I will thank you, Jennifer, for joining us. From my notes, I see that you should say something before we call on Yona. So I'll call on you, and then you might call on Yona. Thank you.
Happy to do that. So I want to thank everybody for yet another timely discussion that Yona has planned for us. There's a couple of current events that I like to bring up just to remind everybody, and I'm sure all of you will speak to these as well, but I certainly don't claim to be an expert in law or really in bioterrorism. So just a couple of my own observations and things that we've been studying at the Potomac Institute, right? So more recently, there was a water supply cyber attack in Florida that I think is really relevant of how do we handle responsibility for that in an age when we have cyber defense and we have all sorts of cybersecurity rules at a federal level. I think that we're still not there in something that is been studied so much, right? And there's even a whole military combatant command associated with it that we don't yet have for bio, but we do have for cyber. But we still don't have all of the laws and how we hold people responsible in an international way really figured out yet. Another discussion of vaccine passports, right? Or another phrase I've heard is a certification of immunity. And are there threats to having that? What are the civil liberties discussions surrounding that? And what does it mean for opening borders and how we handle international travel for both our citizens and other people? And then the third thing that I think comes up to mind, at least, and I really don't want to take much time, is looking at federal versus state rules and policies and laws, right? Because when something happens, local jurisdictions are really they're not only the first responders, but they're the ones that are collecting the information and help do a lot of the accountability and liability. And so when something happens in an outbreak, who do we hold responsible and how do we hold them accountable for the actions that they've caused to the local population, as well as from a national security perspective to the United States, as well as to the rest of the world, not just to our country. And then I'm sure most of you, or at least a couple of you, can speak to the federal statutes that exist of how we go and handle that. And so just a couple topics, and I don't expect you to spend any time necessarily talking about each of those, but just to say today how relevant I think this conversation is and how important it is that we're having an open dialogue about it. So again, thanks for the introduction. And Yona, this is your seminar. He's been with the Institute for close to 25 years running the public discussion on terrorism studies. So over to you, and for you to introduce your very well-renowned crowd.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Jen, for your opening remarks. It really reminds me that going all the way back in 1998, I think, over 22 years ago or so, we held an event on the emerging threats of biological terrorism, research developments and all that. It was a joint program conference between the George Washington University and the Potomac Institute with Mike Swetnam and John O'Gray at the time, founders of the Potomac. At any rate, it reminded me that particular event when we had two interesting, I think, participants who spoke on the program. One was Dr. Ken Alibek, Perhaps some of you may recall that it was a former Soviet bio, I think, expert at the time, with chief. He defected. And the other one was Stephen Atfield, who was at the time at the National Institute of Health. And as you probably know, some of you was involved, at least allegedly, whatever, with the anthrax case. At any rate, it goes really all the way back, and nothing is new under the sun, as we know. I just wanted to mention also that the work that we tried to develop with the International Law Institute for decades related to these issues. And today we have that particular program focusing on the legal issues and various topics, all the way from legislation and treaties, enforcement, prosecution, or whatever it is we're going to deal with. And as Don mentioned, we had events last year, probably about 7 events related to the COVID-19. And we had a number of publications as well. Obviously, all of us, I'm sure, are saddened by the daily statistics on the number of US cases, now more than 30 million, and about 550,000 US deaths. And looking at the international dimension, of course, we're very close to 78 million cases and about 3 million people who died. So we know the situation. We are continuing on this issue and the related topics. So hopefully we can at least modestly encourage more discussion in this particular area. So I would like to welcome, first of all, our panelists, the speakers. You do have the program, and we will follow up with that. So in the interest of time, I will introduce briefly our speakers, and later on, I think we will have a chance to develop some Q&A discussion. Now, our first speaker today is our colleague, Professor Rita Caldwell. She needs no introduction, as we know very well. I think we asked our colleagues at the ILI to put on the screen some of these publications that some of us cooperated with and contributed to. Please go on with this just in general. The different fields that we're going to discuss today and so on. And finally, the one with Rita the past year, and more importantly, the last one on the lab. And we want to mention particularly her latest book on a lab one's own. So we were able to discuss the issues, the challenges to societies over a long period of time. As you know, I'm sure that she is a distinguished university professor, both at the University of Maryland, the College Park, and Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. And she actually is focusing on the global infectious diseases and trying to develop the international network to address many of the emerging infections, diseases, and so on and so forth. And she participated in our work for a number of years now. And I think you are familiar with her many contributions to our discussion. So we asked Rita to perhaps provide some highlights on some of the recent developments related to health and security concerns. Rita?
Oh, thank you very much, Yona. It's a pleasure to meet with this group. I've become to the point where I consider them all friends now, which is great. I'd like to, I sent the slides earlier. Can they be shown? Oh, great, that I don't have to fuss with them. I just want to discuss some background. May I have the next slide, please? I want to make it very clear that we've been suffering pandemics for centuries, and we'll continue to suffer pandemics. And we are presently really in two pandemics. We're currently in the 7th pandemic of cholera, which is a global disease that breaks out periodically, mainly in the underdeveloped or lesser developed parts of the world, but still can strike in the US and particularly in the Gulf of Mexico. But the point I want to make is that we have the COVID-19 pandemic, and the numbers were just recited by Yona and are truly tragic. The threat, therefore, of a biological agent is clearly global stopping. In other words, we have really seen the economy, public health in general, really suffering in a highly dramatic and unequivocal way. May I have the next slide? The important point again is that we need to be prepared, and we've been building on previous pandemics. And I have an example here where we're taking into account social demographic factors, density of populations, economic stability, age, diversity, access to proper housing, medical practices, and now using wastewater analysis, which I have described in previous talks to this group, to predict the COVID-19 epidemic outbreak. We've reached a point now where we can use satellite imagery and we are able to monitor all of these parameters. Now, this has an influence on legal aspects. This involves the ethical practices, the ability to obtain data without personal agreement. There are a variety of legal factors that I hope will be discussed this afternoon. I'd like to also make the point, I think I have another slide. I would like to make the point that with the anthrax investigation, which occurred in 2011, the fact that we were able to work together as a team of interagency representatives and purposely, unofficially, because that allowed us to work free of the Freedom of Information Act, the FBI and the CIA could not have participated in the discussions. This is an interesting aspect of legality in future bioterrorist events. How can the government agencies work together within the rule of law and still be able to ferret out the perpetrator of the bioterrorist act? What we don't see much in the newspapers on a daily basis is that there are ongoing threats right now. They're minor, but the FBI and the CIA are dealing with them. It's usually the mailing of a powder claiming that it's anthrax, or mailing of something claimed to be ricin, a terribly powerful toxic agent. So we do have a kind of ongoing challenge to legal aspects of dealing with, mitigating, protecting against bioterrorist threats. One last point that I'd like to make is that with the monitoring, as we've now been able to do, using what we've learned from previous pandemics, mainly the cholera pandemic, and its environmental factors that have been very dramatically driving the continuation of cholera outbreaks, modifying the predictive model using satellite sensing of environmental factors, we now have a very successful COVID-19 predictor. And I've been participating in a number of collaborations with the British Aid Agency, with the United Nations, and within the US, NASA now has a pandemic response team using these kinds of global monitoring to be able to predict weeks ahead of time the risk of COVID, the risk of malaria, the risk of cholera. So we now have a global monitoring system, and it does pose some interesting questions for the legal community. And so with that very brief overview, very brief introduction, I'm now going to be looking forward to hearing from you all about where we are in the 21st century with the legal aspects of dealing with a very dangerous, terribly dangerous to humanity potential of future pandemics, the COVID-20, the COVID-21. So thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Rita, again, for your insights. Obviously, as always, triggers questions. We will have a chance to discuss them maybe later on in the Q&A, but I just wanted to ask you very quickly, in terms of your own assessment as to the outlook, the threat to humanity, how would you rank, for example, the climate challenge and also the Mother Nature infectious diseases and man-made? I mean, in terms of 1, 2, 3, or they're mixed together?
Well, the argument at the moment is whether, in fact, the COVID-19 was an escape from a laboratory in Wuhan, China, versus a natural release, so to speak, from bats. I personally feel that the greatest threat is Mother Nature, because we as a population are growing from 7 billion to predicted 10 billion. This means that we're encroaching on the territory of the turf, if you will, of animals like bats that we have not in the past, and trampling in the forests of the Amazon and exposing ourselves to pathogenic agents to which we have no immunity, such as the COVID-19 virus. The COVID-19 virus is a member of the Coronaviridae family, of which influenza is one of that family. We are sort of trained or adapted to influenza, whereby we get a booster shot every year. And I think that's what we're up to facing with the COVID-19. But I point out that bats carry a whole number of Coronaviridae viruses. So there are some surprises to come just from bats. How do I compare against man-made? Well, depends on whether or not working in a laboratory, trying to build a vaccine or a response to an heretofore a virus to which we have not heretofore been exposed, if there is a deliberate release, you can see what in fact the outcome can be. So I think it's sort of 6 of one and half a dozen of another with respect to natural and man-made or introduction of a virus. Not the answer you wanted, but that's the best I can give you.
Okay, we'll come back to it, I think, later on. We would like to move on in the interest of time to Professor John Norton Moore. Again, you know, it's very difficult in a minute to describe the contributions of each members of the panel. It will take us not only a semester, but an entire course. At any rate, I just want to mention that John Norton Moore, like Rita Caldwell, needs no introduction. His work over the years as an academic, a lawyer, a diplomat, and government officials, and working with Congress representing the U.S. And it was my great honor to, I remember inviting him going all the way back to the 60s to speak at the Ralph Bunche Institute, the City University of New York, to discuss the threat of terrorism and what can we do in terms of the role of law. So John, would you please take over?
Yona, thank you and Don for running these wonderful programs that bring together this extraordinary group you've got here today and others that you put on each time. And Rita, what a wonderful presentation, and thank you for your great work in this area. What I'm going to talk about rather informally is an opinion piece, some work I've been doing jointly with Guy Roberts, who, as you know, among other things, was the Deputy Secretary General at NATO for Weapons of Mass Destruction, and also 3 top research physicians, one former medical faculty member at Harvard and the chief scientific advisor at the Hospital for Special Surgery in New York, and that's Stephen Goldring. And let me start by saying that social and political institutions change very, very slowly. And that's true even when we deal with major problems. There is a tendency of these institutions, after training people in particular modalities of dealing with such problems, to do the same thing we've done before, except perhaps to do it on a larger scale. And so if you look at the traditional responses to this pandemic, what you will find overwhelmingly is that the expert community is telling us we just simply need to do a much better job at prediction, at testing, at the ability to quarantine and to apply the traditional approaches that we have all seen in dealing with COVID-19. And those things are indeed important. And we should do them much, much better than we have done them before. There's no question, but that we've been lacking in so many of those areas. But I think, and the group I'm working with believe that this misses the core issue of the enormous seriousness of what we're facing now, and another approach altogether that we need to be taking. But before I tell you what that is, let me also suggest that there's another reason in dealing with medical issues and medical public policy that also tracks, I think, the same reason why we're seeing these traditional approaches even in response to the pandemic. And that is, with a few exceptions like dealing with cancer or dealing with AIDS, things that get very, very high political visibility, we have focused almost exclusively in the medical debate on access to healthcare. And we have not had the level of focus that we should, that I believe modern science suggests on actually taking on and dealing with the diseases themselves. And so what our group is recommending, and what we believe is very essential right now in the entire COVID range and influenza range. And yes, Rita, it would be good if we can take them all on. Probably cholera and others need to be taken on this way too, but at least as a starting point to deal with COVID and the entire COVID range and the influenza related range of viruses. And what we believe is that we need to fundamentally take on the virus itself with a massive public-private operation that is very much like, let's say, the Apollo program. Now, let me just give you for a moment the sort of a traditional approach of what we're doing. There is a wonderful study put out by the Council on Foreign Relations, doing its usual very, very high quality work, called Improving Pandemic Preparedness, Lessons from COVID-19. And when you look at this, it is probably one of the best compilations of doing the right, the usual things, the traditional things that I've seen. But one member of this group with a background in biological development of antivirals, et cetera, said, no, we need to do something else in addition to these things. It's not either or, but in addition, critically in addition. We need to take on the viruses themselves. We need to have a very fundamental attack on the viruses themselves and everything you need to do with it in relation to antivirals, in relation to speed of development of vaccines and all the rest in trying to go at it. Only 2 other members of the group joined that proposal. The recent excellent presentation in the Wall Street Journal of what do we do with the pandemic was, again, here are all the things we need to do better than we've been doing in the traditional approach. But no one is basically saying, no, it is now time to have a fundamental attack on the viruses themselves in relation at least to the COVID grouping and the influenza grouping. Now, what are some of the fundamental reasons supporting that? The first is, I think that we are hugely underestimating the economic cost and effect globally of what's going on here. The estimate is that the COVID cost to the United States alone, quite apart from some of the terrible, in my judgment, things that the over expenditures of the Democratic administration, quite apart from that, COVID alone is going to hit us over a period of years at a total cost of about $16 trillion. Now, add that to what's happening all over the world. And you add this also to what happened in 2008 and 2009 economically, that we really haven't fundamentally come out of even yet. Massive liquidity expansion from the Federal Reserves and central banks all over the world, which hasn't even stopped after 2008-09. If we have another major pandemic within the next few years, perhaps the next 10 years, on top of this one, I think the potential for some kind of terrible, terrible, lasting, very, very difficult to get out of global depression and other issues economically that would go with it are very serious, including the level of political unrest that would likely follow such an event. The second gets us to the bioterror component of it, because there are a number of reasons that suggest that this is raised the risk of bioterror. One of those is that, at least so far, it looks as though the democratic West has been economically and otherwise and politically affected more than have the non-democratic players in the process. Those players also are the ones that are more attracted to the potential of use of bio weapons. Then we throw in the other element here is that, as Rita has indicated, we now have this CRISPR technology. For those of you that don't follow it as Rita does, that's clustered regularly interspaced palindromic repeats, which is a methodology for being able to take the RNA and to dramatically alter it. Now, when we think about this in the other terrible weapons of mass destruction of nuclear, there's lots of awful news with nuclear, but the one bit of good news is you have to get the plutonium and you have to get the U-235, and it's damned hard to do. You can't just walk down the street and find it. You can't just be a second-rate terror group and find it. It's very, very difficult to do. But there's some reason to believe that CRISPR technology in producing some of the bio stuff is going to turn out to be a lot easier. And we know that ISIS, among others, and other terror groups have been experimenting with it. A third component of all this is that when we look at the implications for national security, it's really staggering, because national security depends so much on a sound and strong economy, and the implications of all this for our economy is just so great. The implications for hitting our troops in the field is so great. And just as most of you know, that's been repeated over and over, but I can't resist this one. So far, as Bob Turner and I have added some of this stuff up, and thank you, Bob, it looks as though we have already, with COVID-19 alone, killed more Americans. We're already up to over half the total combatant casualties in all wars fought by the United States in its entire history, including the Civil War. You have to look at that and say, wait a minute, guys, we got some national security problem here. Finally, as kind of a fourth reason, let's go to a very good point that Rita made. If you look at what we're doing with influenza, well, we're having people, even with the every year making the new vaccines for it, the new booster shots, we're still losing from 20 to 60,000 Americans every single year with the influenza viruses year after year. Now, COVID-19 is at least 10 times deadlier. And so that's, you really want to have 200,000 to 600,000 deaths every year repeating in the United States from COVID-19. I would suggest to you that alone is going to do some pretty terrible things to the economy and to our national security and to the stability of our political process and a lot rest. So the point is, we need this major public-private partnership as the #1 thing to be taking on the COVID, and at the same time actually take on the influenza vaccines themselves. Now, what's the cost of this thing, and is any of this doable? I suppose we won't fully know whether it's doable until we try. But this is something we must try. And let's just look at the cost of what the original Biden pandemic package, quite apart from the new one he's revealing today, his pandemic package was $2 trillion. What did it cost for the entire Apollo program in relation to the public-private partnership there? The answer is it was only $23 billion in 2019 terms. So this is chump change compared to the damage, the economic damage, and even the opportunistic spending that is being done in the name of COVID-19. So I would say we desperately need to add another element in what we're doing. We need to take on, sorry for my phone going off. We need to take on the virus itself in a fundamental effort, dealing with effects on organs, dealing with antivirals, dealing with vaccines, dealing with speed of vaccine production, dealing with learning everything possible about the COVID and influenza groupings, and take them on as the best we can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John, for your insights. I think your suggestion or recommendation to undertake perhaps an Apollo project or approach. Some are calling for a Manhattan perhaps approach, whatever it is. In other words, maybe out of the box, so that the terrorists would think twice or 10 times before they use a weapon, if they know what society can do to reduce the risks. So, so in other words, your actually suggestion for private-public partnership in this area is the best practices, maybe strategy. The debate, we cannot hear you. I cannot anyway.
Okay, I think it's essential that in addition to doing much better at the usual things, and I would endorse strongly the Council on Foreign Relations report, the points that Rita's making, we want to do those things, but it's not enough. This risk is far greater than that. It's too big. The effect on the whole world is too great. It's too unpredictable. We're seeing new versions of this in the first 6 months that are already coming out. And there's no reason to believe we're not going to continue to have new variants of COVID-19 that hopefully will have protection from existing vaccines. But maybe that protection level will go down dramatically. Maybe for certain it won't even be there. So we need to do more. We need to utilize another thing that's been going on, which is COVID-19 has shifted a huge amount of the medical research budget to looking at things like COVID-19 and influenza and vaccines and antivirals. And because of that, we also, to have such a program at this time, have an advantage going forward in terms of what the medical community is already working on.
Okay, thanks a lot. We'll come back to some of the points that you made. We would have to move on our program and invite our colleague, Professor Abe Sofer, who is the George Shultz Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford. Again, like the others, it's so difficult even to mention all the contributions that he made. Even difficult for me trying to follow what he had done as an academic or legal scholar or assistant U.S. attorney, judge, government official, private practice, military service, everything else. But at any rate, we are familiar with his many contributions in scholarship. And I think I have a whole series of books that he published all the way from Iran to the maritime issues and so on and so forth. So I think that perhaps, Abe, can you try to enlighten us in terms of your thinking as to the approach of law during the pandemics? Could you hear me, Abe?
I had to unmute myself. Thank you, Yona. Thank you for that. And I really mean it when I say that I agreed to talk about the legal strategy for dealing with biothreats, only because so many of my old friends were involved in this project, including John and Don. And I want to mention also that Bob Turner has joined us. So welcome, Bob, and it's great to see you again. So yes, this is a very interesting subject and a very difficult one. And that was also an attractant to the notion of trying to put some ideas out about a legal strategy to enhance protection of human health. I know that some people will talk about national legal strategies, but I'm going to focus on the quote impossible, or certainly more difficult, an international legal strategy and the elements of it. Because Yona and Don and certainly Professors Caldwell, Kerr, and others, including my brilliant colleague Lucy Shapiro at Stanford, have described the technologies available to states and non-state actors and the insecurities that relate to nature-generated threats, and as well as the transnational nature of both the threats and the measures available. I am going to focus on the fact that legal experts, despite this huge threat that we have, would have to acknowledge that while states have adopted national laws related to biothreats, nothing that could be characterized as a legally enforceable transnational mandate has been adopted. Perhaps the staggering costs of COVID-19 that John has talked about will change this situation. If not, I agree with him that even more destructive developments await us. But given my recently departed hero, George Shultz's approach to international problems, I think it's time to prepare the garden, as he would put it, by planting some ideas that could advance protection against these quintessentially transnational dangers. Now, for purposes of regulation, I see biothreats as falling into three categories: the bioweapons created by states and non-state actors, the biodisasters caused by humans, and the biodisasters caused by nature, sometimes with human responsibility. Each category potentially generates major incidents, but as Rita said, the greatest disasters thus far have been caused by natural forces and human error. Now, the role of law in dealing with threats generated in these three categories is modest. The Biological and Toxins Weapons Convention sweeping declaration that all states, parties, now numbering 180, agree not to develop or use biological weapons is just that, a declaration. The BTWC has no enforcement provisions and covers only the development and use of weapons. It permits research and even testing of biological substances, toxins, viruses. Now, efforts have been made to extend the work of entities created pursuant to that treaty to mitigate some excluded dangers. These are useful, but all voluntary. The World Health Organization has authorities that create moral pressure on states to report health threats, but its standards cannot be enforced. The WHO, for example, was able to convince China to permit a group of experts to visit Wuhan to determine how COVID-19 originated, but the group's work was restricted, particularly as to whether the virus was released from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, leading the Wall Street Journal this morning to condemn the WHO's report as Wuhan whitewash. Now, International agencies do exist that significantly reduce transnational dangers through legal regulation. These so-called specialized, as opposed to political agencies of the UN, for example, the International Civil Aviation Organization, the International Maritime Organization, have assemblies in which all member states are represented with authority to approve standards, practices, programs, and those assemblies are served by technical committees that develop the standards and other proposals for the assemblies to consider. And councils appointed by the assemblies guide the work of the technical committees and assemblies. Now, the WHO is also a specialized agency. Its World Health Assembly of all 194 member states elects an executive board of 34 members who are supposed to be technically qualified in the field of health, as well as a director general. The executive committee, led by the DG, implements decisions of the World Health Assembly and advises and facilitates on the World Health Assembly's activities. The WHO has roots that go back to the mid-19th century, and at this point has over 7,000 employees implementing programs through 6 semi-autonomous regional offices, some 150 field offices, with a budget that has increased from the 5 million it received in 1948 to over 7 billion, and all contributions are voluntary. Now, the contributions of specialized agencies to transnational security develop slowly and they are imperfect, but they are valuable. The IMO, for example, has adopted hundreds of rules and regulations improving maritime safety. ICAO has adopted regulations that govern the conduct of commercial aviation, including where and when non-military planes may fly, as well as requirements that they be certified as safe. The WHO, too, has many achievements to its credit, especially in collecting and disseminating healthcare-related data and in undertaking projects to eliminate or curb diseases, including smallpox, polio, malaria, Ebola, and most recently, its efforts on COVID-19. So the question is, why, although we've demonstrated the capacity collectively to adopt and enforce useful regulatory structures to deal with some transnational challenges, have we been so slow in even considering how to use international law to enhance safety from biological threats? National protections remain inadequate, but in individual states are improving protection through legal requirements. International efforts, on the other hand, have been limited to voluntary cooperation and ad hoc actions. I would submit the most fundamental reason for this situation is that the US has lost interest in pursuing multilateral arrangements to deal with transnational problems. Now, I know that we all know that transnational regimes have always had deficiencies and drawbacks. Nonetheless, we engaged in multilateral efforts from the Charter's adoption until the early 1990s. As legal advisor at the State Department from 1985 to 1990, I helped shepherd into existence or improve such agreements as the International Space Station, the Antarctica Convention, the INF Treaty, the Maritime Terrorism Convention, the Montreal Convention concerning air pollution, and ratification of the Genocide and Torture Conventions. But then came the proposal to create an international criminal court. The US government worked on that proposal in good faith. We attempted to develop a forum in which to try major violators of established international crimes, but the process was taken over by states determined to include as defendants states that violated the narrow view that many international lawyers have of the legitimate use of force. They made no secret that they were aiming at us. The Rome Conference, at which the convention made illegal uses of force criminal and attempted to deprive the Security Council's permanent members of the power to veto such efforts, concluded that treaty. And since then, other major disappointments have followed, including the ICJ's taking jurisdiction over use of force and capital punishment issues under FCN treaties and the Consular Convention. The US has reacted to this by refusing to support the ICC and withdrawing from the ICJ's jurisdiction under the FCN and consular treaties. But in addition, the US has largely given up on using international treaties and agencies to develop and implement policies, even when such efforts might advance US interests. We need, I believe, to get back to engaging internationally when it is in our interest to do so. We know how to fight for what we believe in, and we must be prepared to agree acceptable compromises when necessary. That is the nature of politics, both national and international. And developing an effective legal strategy to defend against international bio and chemical threats would serve US interests. And progress now, let me go over what I think would be some of the elements, the basic fundamental elements of an international system. And the beginning step in this regard, because of what I've said about the US losing interest in multilateral initiatives, will only be possible if the US resolves to pursue the objective of an improved international structure, despite the difficulties we have encountered with such efforts. Now, to deal with the difficulties, any sound strategy must enhance protection against biothreats by shifting, and this might not be consistent with current assumptions, from the emphasis on the BTWC and bioweapons to an emphasis on fashioning responses to health issues. State parties to the WHO are much more likely, I believe, to cooperate in dealing with biological threats in a context that excludes potential determinations related to their BTCW or CWC responsibilities. The desire of states to retain control of national security issues, including the US, is exemplified in the policies adopted to achieve other multilateral agreements. Governments approved the Montreal Convention regulating civilian aviation because it exempts military aircraft. The Maritime Conventions became practicable by exempting national navies. The desire of states to keep military security issues under their control can also be seen in the limitation imposed on the WHO in considering radiological threats caused by nuclear activities. The IAEA has the primary responsibility for dealing with those threats. The WHO is entitled only to promote coordinating international health activities on the issue. Now, while efforts to develop rules relating to non-military biothreats should avoid relying on the BTWC, any such effort would have to rely on the WHO, given its experience and resources. But in addition to the usual shortcomings of major UN agencies, the WHO has a wide range of objectives that includes many which are less concrete and urgent than protecting human health from biothreats. For example, the WHO issues recommendations concerning morbidity, mortality, pregnancy, childhood, adolescence, sexual health, unhealthy substances, food safety, sustainable development, surgical safety, and even restrictions on computer use. It would be futile to attempt to limit the scope of the WHO's interests. But it seems an essential element of a sound legal strategy to create a separate WHO entity to deal exclusively with biohazards. In addition to ensuring separate WHO focus on this concern, such an administrative arrangement would have at least two additional benefits. It would enable states to restrict the WHO's proposed new legal authorities to the tasks associated with biothreats rather than allow them to run essentially rampant in being applied on all the activities that are associated with the WHO. And it would also enable states financially to target support to biothreat activities. Now, determining what new powers and responsibilities to give the WHO to deal with biothreats will require input from scientific experts and individuals with national and international regulatory experience. But any new strategy should rely on the agency's current programs with modifications aimed at improving outcomes through mandates that are both effective and acceptable to member states. I'll touch on 4 or so of these. First, reporting requirements. Information is at the heart of the WHO's requirements in its efforts to improve healthcare worldwide, and we need accurate and prompt reporting, particularly in dealing with major diseases, pandemics, and emergencies, including reviewing the work at research facilities to determine compliance with established standards and to identify dangerous developments. A sound strategy would, I believe, include making mandatory all reporting requirements related to biothreats under WHO jurisdiction. Secondly, safety standards. The WHO has issued or refers to safety standards for labs engaged in research with dangerous biological substances or toxins. Existing standards should be used, amended as necessary, to certify and inspect such research facilities, whether under government or private control. And these remedial measures should be, and some remedial measures should be identified to encourage compliance with certification requirements, as in the fields of airline and maritime safety. Third, the issue of preparedness. Recent pandemics have demonstrated the need for a higher level of international preparedness, and some of this should be mandated through rules of law, requiring equipment to be produced and stored at centers worldwide, and requiring states to maintain some capacities and assisting them in doing so. Teams of experts and volunteers, including NGOs such as the Red Cross, should be organized and kept in readiness to be sent to trouble spots, much as the UN sends peacekeepers. The WHO should engage in developing guidelines for these activities. In addition, cooperation and assistance should be pursued in a formal manner. I don't believe, however, or I should say I do believe, however, that the US should insist that the WHO, in its international efforts to support needy states particularly, should avoid efforts to require states, such as the US, for example, to sacrifice the health of their populations or to surrender benefits based on natural resources, facilities, contractual arrangements, or financial incentives for drug and device discovery, such as we have. Engagement in assisting needy peoples should not mean surrendering national commitments and values. Finally, even a skeletal version of an international legal strategy must include an understanding as to the manner in which new authorities should be implemented. Here again, the most effective options will not necessarily be those that seem obvious. Competent WHO personnel operating out of regional or national offices will be necessary to report information, to perform inspections and certifications, to assist in preparedness, and to deal with emergencies. But these personnel will operate more effectively if they act in conjunction with national agencies rather than being seen as policing national performance. WHO personnel must remain independent, but the authorities they will be exercising are unprecedented if my suggestions are adopted, and are likely to be approved by WHO member states only if their role is to assist rather than to supervise national systems. In conclusion, the COVID-19 pandemic has shaken the world and caused great damage, but it may also have made states willing to try to manage biothreats, not merely through national measures and ad hoc and unreliable international cooperation, but also by enhancing the international system to create clear priorities, legal obligations in essential areas, and effective administrative mechanisms. As former Ambassador Charles Ray has said, we must revitalize our moribund diplomatic capability essential to building and maintaining the web of relationships that are critical to mounting global campaigns against global threats. Disputes about the WHO's capacity to resist Chinese pressure to cover up what happened in Wuhan should not obscure the US interest in advancing global health. As Secretary Shultz testified after the Soviets shot down the Korean airliner passenger airplane in 1983, President Reagan made sure the world knew the full, unvarnished truth about the atrocity. Nevertheless, he also sent our arms control negotiators back to Geneva because he believed that a reduction in nuclear weapons was a critical priority. Enhancing the WHO's legal authority will, if anything, enhance its capacity to resist political pressure and advance global health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abe, for your proposal, and which is really based on many years of experience. And obviously, we should study it in great detail. My question is, in terms of the gaps that we have in the conventions that you mentioned, the biological and the chemical weapons issue, they seem to be really at a crossroad at this time. And you mentioned that there is a role for, I think, diplomacy. You mentioned Charlie Ray, for example, and hopefully we can revive U.S. leadership in this area. And the big question is how to convince or persuade countries like China and Russia, North Korea, and Syria, Iran, and the list is long, to cooperate on this issue. So the question is, are there any other options available to the international community to somehow persuade those countries who are pushing all the time for their interest in this area of WMD to revise somehow their approach to the common problem?
Well, I think that's a fundamental question, Yona. And you've had papers, and Rita has made comments about the issue of bioweapons and how to improve that regime. And I fully support those proposals, but I believe that the bioweapons issue is a far more difficult one to actually obtain legal enforcement mechanisms for than the health issue if you separate it from the weapons issue. So just as in aviation, maritime, and other areas of international activity, the national security dimension of these problems is something that should be handled, and at least is likely to be handled along the lines that it's presently being handled, with the, I hope, the support for the kind of proposals that your scholars, the scholars who've appeared in your forum, such as Rita, have recommended. confidence building measures and other things of that sort. But if you try to mix in the bioweapons with biohealth, bio threats that aren't national security, I think you would never get a legally mandated rules in the areas that I described.
All right, so that's really the key question. Seems to me the chicken or the egg. Basically, whether of course, the United States and its leadership, the international community, are prepared at this stage to identify and prevent and counter the current and perhaps the future biological threats or chemical threats, radiological, the nuclear, and so forth. And on our program, we do have also representatives from the UN, and I think she probably will touch on some of the issues that you raised, and then we will have a chance, the Q&A session, to come back to it. So may I move on, Abe, and call upon the next speaker according to our program right here. If you can look at that. We have now from the United Nations at this time, Ms. Maria Rotary, who actually at this time she's working at the United Nations Counterterrorism Center, and within this Office of Counterterrorism at the New York headquarters. And she is actually involved also in preventing, responding to weapons of mass destruction, some of those that you touched upon, and the issue of terrorism. And incidentally, prior to that, she worked with this United Nations interregional global crime and justice research institute to implement some of the European Union, I think, risk mitigation centers of excellence and so forth. And she, for example, also worked on as a regional coordinator for the Southeast Asia in Manila. So she's an attorney, and she was also trained by some of our colleagues, the University of St. Andrews in the United Kingdom. Maria, are you there?
Yes, I'm here, Professor Alexander. Thank you.
So it's all yours, and you have a PowerPoint.
Thank you. Yes, I have prepared a PowerPoint, so I'm grateful for the colleagues from your office to help me to project it. Right. So I would like to start by thanking very much you and your team for inviting our office to be part of this important discussion. I'm really honored to be part of the panel with such distinguished speakers and knowledgeable. And I think it will be difficult for me to keep up to the standards, but I hope I can bring the perspective of the United Nations and the framework on countering bioterrorism, although many of them has already touched upon this topic. So I will try to go over them from a different perspective. So if that's okay, I will ask your colleagues to pass to the first slide. So I will first speak about the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism. Next slide, please. So very briefly, for all of you to know who we are. So the Office of Counterterrorism was established by the General Assembly in June 2017 by a resolution. It was the first reform of the new Secretary General Guterres. Then he decided to reform the security architecture of the United Nations and create a standalone office on counterterrorism issues. So the previously existing entities of the UN dealing with this, that was a counterterrorism implementation task force and a counterterrorism center, that were originally under the Department of Political Affairs of the UN were all moved to a standalone office, and that office was appointed to be headed by Vladimir Voronkov, that is Under Secretary General for Counterterrorism. So this happened in 2017, and our office came to life. Next slide, please. And we were given 5 main functions, out of which I will discuss 2 for the sake of brevity and time. We have the mandate to strengthen the delivery of the United Nations counterterrorism capacity building assistance to member states. And I will give you more examples about this later. What are we doing currently, particularly with a focus on bio? But we also been given the mandate to coordinate the coherence across the UN and the coordination of more than 43 entities dealing with counterterrorism. So it's not us dealing with counterterrorism, it's many, many entities that has been mentioned by Professor Sofer. So we have ICAO, we have UNODC, we have Interpol. So we have many, many, many actors in the picture since, you know, the resolution from the Security Council came together. Many, many actors started working on this. So it's a very complex world in the UN, the counterterrorism mandate. So because of that, the General Assembly came together and decided to put one overall coordinating body that is our office. So next slide, please. So within these 2 main functions, one, as I mentioned, capacity building, in 2018, a program which I had was launched on enhancing the capacities of member states, international organizations, and also UN entities to prevent, prepare for, and respond to a terrorist attack involving WMD or civilian materials. And also we have a coordination role, and within that coordination compact that was established with those 43 entities, there is a specific working group that is working on emerging threats covering WMD and CBRN, and also critical infrastructure protection. And I will be happy to share more as I go through my presentation on this. So my next slide is related to more or less the legal aspects. So of course I will not get into details on all the framework and all the conventions that exist, because some of the speakers already talk about that, but the main highlights and the more important instruments that we're currently operating with on the bioterrorism prevention and response arena. So next slide, please. So first of all, I would like to mention that the General Assembly resolution that is giving us the mandate. So it's the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy. So in 2006, the General Assembly unanimously agreed to create a strategy with a series of actions and pillars on how to take coordinated, let's say, activities to tackle together the issue of combating terrorism. So there is a couple of recommendations and actions that is being reviewed every 2 years. So this is a document that is constantly updated every 2 years by member states, by the General Assembly. And this year, we will have the 7th review of this document. Unfortunately, last year, because of the pandemic, it couldn't be convened the meeting in the UN headquarters. So instead, we had a UN Counterterrorism Week to discuss different topics and issue agendas with a focus on the pandemic. I will also talk about this later. So this is the General Assembly. From the Security Council side of the United Nations, we have several Security Council resolutions dealing with the issue of biomaterials or bioterrorism. So the first resolution that came after 9/11, 1373 of 2001, touched upon the concern of materials. So recognize the connection between international terrorism and illegal movement of civilian materials, particularly bio. But the most important and the most iconic resolution for our work is the 1540 resolution of 2004, through which the Security Council affirmed that the proliferation of civilian weapons and the means of delivery constitutes a threat to international peace and security, and also obliging member states to refrain from, by any means, non-state actors from developing, acquiring, manufacturing, possessing, transporting, transferring, or using these kind of weapons and their means of delivery. So, and there is another resolution that is recent, like that is 2325, that connects to 1540, that it calls upon member states to strengthen their anti-proliferation regimes to enhance implementation of 1540. In addition, it's important to note that the Secretary General in his disarmament agenda, and this is an agenda implemented by the United Nations Office on Disarmament, it's called Securing Our Common Future. It also touched upon the threat of WMD weapons and disarmament to save humanity. That's the chapter that deals with this. So just to mention that the possibility of a terrorist attack involving biological agents is a concern for the international community, same as for member states, because as mentioned by other speakers, in comparison with other weapons of mass destruction, the access, if you want, or the materials of bacteria, viruses, or toxins particularly, is relatively inexpensive, easy to produce and handle, and also to transport. So some of the speakers mentioned CRISPR and all the technologies and DIY. So the bio poses a threat and is not as well regulated as other weapons like the regime established by the IAEA, for example. So there is a gap and there is a concern. So into these concerns, also we can add the scientific developments and emerging technologies, such as biotechnology and synthetic biology, and even the use of artificial intelligence that combined with these agents could also increase the level of the threat. So I would like to move to the next slide, please. So it was also presented by Professor Sofer, the convention, so the Biological Weapons Convention of 1972, that presents a regime to regulate biological weapons, but we are looking this at the perspective from terrorist groups accessing this. So the convention, of course, is more focused on member states, but it gives a little bit of a buffer or a small niche to also deal with these issues, and there have been several meetings of experts in Geneva dealing with also the threat of deliberate events by non-state actors. And in addition, there is a Secretary General mechanism for investigation of alleged use of chemical and biological weapons. That is the custodian of this instrument is the United Nations Office for Disarmament Affairs, and for instance, this mechanism has been activated in Syria when the chemical weapons were used by terrorist groups as well. So in addition to this, and also in connection with what was being presented by Professor Sofer and the reflections on WHO, I would like to mention that we are working very closely with them, not only within our working group on counterterrorism, but also within the UN framework. The Secretary General has decided to create a UN biorisk working group. And in this biorisk working group, we're looking at the different angles of the risks. And one of them, of course, is deliberate events. And the leaders of these groups are WHO and also UNODA. So WHO has been dealing with an initiative since I believe 2018 that is called Health and Security Interface. So of course, they mostly focus on their main functions are on public health, but there have been looking into this with this initiative of bringing together security sectors and health sectors, so putting together them for investigative purposes. They have been working with Interpol to train medical personnel in investigations, joint investigations. So there has been some efforts going on, of course, not in a larger scale, but things are moving, of course, with the pandemic. The UN is scaling up its efforts under the leadership of WHO and United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs, and the engagements of the Executive Office of the Secretary General. So in this group, there are UN entities dealing with humanitarians, aspects, and also UN entities dealing with security aspects, and also development. So it's a group, a combined group that is coming together for meetings and understanding how we can put a response in the field in this case. And also within our working group on counterterrorism since 2015, more than 20 agencies have been working together to identify which are the gaps in the response to a biological and a chemical terrorist attack. So which is the role of the UN, the interagency cooperation, if such an attack takes place, and how to support member states. So I will now move into the specific perspective of COVID-19 and bioterrorism. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So I just wanted I just put here a quote of our Secretary General when he was briefing the Security Council. So I quote, "The weakness and lack of preparedness exposed by this pandemic provide a window on how a bioterrorist attack might unfold and may increase its risks. Non-state groups could gain access to virulent strains that could pose similar devastation to societies around the globe." End of the quote. So this is to mention that it has been in the political agenda of the UN. This issue has been brought at the level of the Security Council, the General Assembly. There has been discussions ongoing. And in this regard, very focused on what we do. If we can move to the next slide. We had a counterterrorism week last year in July, because we couldn't have the review of the strategy. We moved to a virtual format, and the discussions based on a pandemic. So there were the pandemic from the different perspectives. So one of those was, of course, the threat of bioterrorism. And then we had very distinguished and high-level speakers like the Undersecretary General for Disarmament. We have member states as well, FAO, Interpol, and WHO, and all of them agree that there is a risk of bioterrorism increase with the pandemic. So I put here the link for the interest of the audience. There is a report on that meeting, and there is also the findings. But I just want to highlight with you that, of course, pandemics and epidemics as well, such as Ebola, for instance, present an opportunity that might inspire these terrorist groups to perpetrate biological attacks at a time where countries are acting already in a protracted crisis. So when they are at the weakest point, this could present an opportunity for terrorists to perpetrate attacks. Also, and I will give more examples later, some terrorist and violent extremist groups have called for biological attacks by spreading COVID-19. So this crisis also put to test the national and international emergency preparedness and response mechanisms that could also be activated if there is a biological attack. So it's the same issue from different perspectives. So how could the pandemic help to improve the response to a bioattack, and how the existing measures for preventing a bioattack could help to deal with the pandemic? So also we should think of the possibility of critical infrastructure being attacked. So hospitals, vaccine productions. So all of these are potential targets that, of course, with the criticality of the pandemic, becomes more of a potential target. So next slide, please. So for instance, I just wanted to share that because we are a capacity building agency, the Counterterrorism Center, with the pandemic, we couldn't go to the field and we couldn't help member states to increase their capabilities. So what we did was to move to an awareness raising mode, and we held a couple of events and seminars. And for instance, here, in July, we had a discussion on the possibility, the specter of bioterrorism within the context of a pandemic. And we had speakers like Interpol, we have, Europol, member states, and also even biotechnology institutes bring in their different perspectives. So next slide, please. And and also if of interest of the audience, we prepared a video on a scenario of the misuse of biotechnology. So what happens if a terrorist group try to push a scientist to alter the genetic sequence of a virus and really create a very dangerous virus and unleash a pandemic again. So we are looking into these scenarios through a project that we have with different UN entities, and a report will be issued in the summer. And I will be, of course, happy to share with the Institute on the findings on this. But we're looking at different things like how technology could pose a solution, but at the same time, how it could be misused. So science and technology. So next slide, please. So what is actually our office doing on that? And perhaps in the interest of time, I will try to be brief because I like to also leave time for the discussion. So next slide. So this is very important project we have with Interpol. So we are going to have a global study on the threat on non-state actors and the potential misuse of civilian materials. So we're gonna look into leverage the national law enforcement information that Interpol receives to develop strategic level regional threat assessments. So this is also connected to this seminar because you're talking about strategies. So this also helps to strategies. So if you understand better where the threat is, also you can develop a better strategy. We will be looking into groups of malicious non-state actors which have been involved in sourcing, smuggling, acquiring, deploying, or attempted to deploy civilian e-materials. So we're going to look into regions like Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, Western, Central, and Southern Asia, and the Americas. So the first report on Middle East and North Africa will be also ready for the summer. And next slide, please. So just to give a flavor of the threat of bioterrorism and how it was presented during our launching event by Interpol. So just a couple of data and information. So the first half of 2020, there were several attempts at deliberate COVID-19 contamination through direct human-to-human contact. So this is an issue of concern for Interpol, of course. In April 2020, there was a plot of surface contamination with COVID-19 against law enforcement in Tunisia, which was foiled. And also in September 2020, there were raisins letters sent to the US President and law enforcement agencies. So this is just to mention that the examples are still relatively recent. And we, although sometimes they always say that the low probability, high impacts of WMD terrorism, we should remain vigilant. Next slide, please. So in addition, our office launched a couple of courses, 20 actually, on preventing and responding to WMD terrorism to support member states' capabilities. And I just highlighted some of them that are important on bio. So we're currently conducting next week one in Iraq, so outbreak containment for law enforcement. And we have been receiving a lot of requests on bio from member states to support their structures. Next slide, please. So very briefly, we're working with the State Department on a project in Iraq to support their government, academia, and industry in different aspects, but most importantly on clandestine laboratories. So when terrorist groups are trying to assemble chemical or biological weapons, we also work with on security culture, increasing security culture in academia. We will also work on a biosecurity strategy, so how to respond, and also some trainings. And last project I wanted to mention, and with that I will conclude my presentation. Next slide, please. Is well, here we have also, this is another thing that might be interested of the audience. We generated a 360 module where you can access a clandestine laboratory and see which are the different instruments that the terrorists could use to prepare weapons. So this was done together with the State Department and the Department of Energy. So next slide, please. We also have a project with NATO, the first UN NATO project, and we're working on response to a terrorist attack with Jordanian stakeholders. And there we will also have a big field exercise to test capabilities and a national response plans on how to respond to a civilian attack. So I know it's a lot of information, but I hope this brings a little bit of flavor of what we're actually doing on counterterrorism and bioterrorism. Thank you.
I want to thank again Maria for this really exceptional, I think, overview of the UN system in terms of structures and programs and training and so on and so forth related to our topic. the broad area of WMD and so forth. So my question to you, and we'll come back to the maybe discussion, to follow up also Professor Exuper when he spoke about the International Criminal Court. You invite the attempt to deal with some of the legal structures from the political point of view. My question to you, aside from the political aspect and the legal aspect and law enforcement and all that, my question to you is, how do you dovetail the social and economic role of the United Nations, whether you deal with the impact on children, or refugees, or poverty, human rights issues, and so forth? I mean, do you have actually an approach that tries to provide the interdisciplinary approach to the problem?
Thank you, Professor. Well, I can answer with different frameworks. So, for instance, of course, we're working on children through the returnee perspective. For instance, we're helping returnees to resettle, and particularly the issues of returnee children is very focused on our agenda. So, of course, I'm not talking about biological terrorism now. I'm talking about counterterrorism per se. So, of course, our office deals with different subjects that relates with victims, relates also with returnees, with foreign terrorist fighters, financing of terrorism. So we do have a comprehensive perspective to terrorism, and this comes also from the Global Counterterrorism Strategy. In addition, we are working with the leading agencies on that. So we're working with UNICEF, we're working with UNDP, so mostly the development and human rights as well. So within the compact, we try to ensure that all these priorities for the UN are also tackled in the counterterrorism actions. And in addition, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, that they are this framework that the UN put together to ensure security, but also development and economic progress. So we are under SDG 16, that is institutions enhancing institutional framework. So we are working under SDG 16 to do that. So with the particular focus on bio, we consider certain specificities for the response. We do look at gender aspects, we do look at human rights concern, we look at children, but it's more the office per se that deals with the whole coordination of humanitarian development and economic.
Okay, thank you very much. I think obviously we have to consider the different options and opportunities that the UN offers, including technical assistance, training, and so on. We'll come back to you, Maria. We have to move on to our next colleague. So maybe we can move to Bob Turner, Robert Turner. Are you in?
Yes.
Wonderful.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I want to make sure my mic's not.
Right. And again, as I mentioned, Bob, I don't know if you were there, that all of you on the panel, we can spend semester, a full year to deal with your many contributions, again, in so many different fields. I recall your military service in Vietnam, as well as an academic, a lawyer and publisher, and so on. Over the years, we had the opportunity to cooperate. So can you share with us some of your views on that topic, the role of law?
Sure, Yona. First, I want to start off by commending you and Don Wallace and everybody involved in this truly outstanding program. You asked me to be a commentator, and in past programs, you've had me go first. And going last, my first thought was, well, I'm just going to summarize some of the broad conclusions. And I can't do that. My real temptation here is to spend my 3 to 5 minutes applauding everyone who's just done a great job. Bravo. It was an honor to be here. Now, John Moore, who's been my best friend for I guess since about 1974. And as he mentioned, we did some calculations on the COVID fatalities in the United States versus the losses we suffered in every war since the country was founded. And I would only add to that the COVID-19 fatalities occurred in a single year. You know, this has been a devastating loss. I've been listening to some commentators on the TV, you know, sort of downplaying it. And this has been a tremendous, it's now, I think, the third high in the last, in 2020, it was the third highest cost of life behind heart disease and cancer. I used to think of myself as an expert on biological chemical weapons. I started this out over 50 years ago as an Army recon platoon leader in Schofield Barracks, Hawaii, when somebody above me was assigned with picking someone to attend a 2-week chemical, biological, radiological warfare school. And I guess I'd done something, taken his parking place or something, so I got the job. And turned out I enjoyed it. And I actually got into sort of a contest with a Marine colonel who said a Marine captain who said he was going to be #1. So I studied and I wound up being the honor graduate. And when I got to Vietnam, because I had some background on Vietnamese communism, they detailed me to work out of the Special Projects Office of the North Vietnamese Affairs Office of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. And I spent a lot of time in the field investigating terrorism incidents. But as far as I can tell, the only use of bugs by the Viet Cong was using scorpions and hornets as booby traps to make the lives of American soldiers a little bit less pleasant. Things have changed a lot in terms of the threats. Listening to this group, I am reminded of the story of the gentleman who lived through the 1889 Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania. And he spent most of the rest of his life traveling around giving lectures to Kiwanis clubs, Rotary clubs, and the like about what the Great Flood was like. And he finally passed away and he went to heaven, and St. Peter did an interview with him, and he said, "Did anything happen in your life that was particularly noteworthy?" And he said, "Well, yes, actually, I lived through the Johnstown flood." And St. Peter said, "You know, we have a lunch group that gets together once a week, and I know they'd love to hear if you could next Wednesday make a presentation on your memories. I'm sure they would love it." And he said, "Oh, I would enjoy doing that." And St. Peter got up and introduced him, and as he walked up onto the stage, St. Peter nodded and said, "You see that old guy with the beard in the corner?" "Yeah." He says, "That's Noah." In this group, I am not an expert, and I am not going to spend a lot of time talking about biological warfare. I do want to mention one thing, because we have natural causes, we have accidental causes, but we have a tremendous risk of intentional man-made bioterrorism. Al-Qaeda, back in the 20th century, Al-Qaeda was playing around trying to get ricin and anthrax and other toxins. And we have groups in this country on the right and the left who would love to be able to cause some real serious damage because they're so angry. And one of the things that I have drawn from my decades working in this business is deterrence is based upon perceptions of strength and will. But most rational human beings pursue their perceived self-interest. As John Moore can tell you, I'm not a Donald Trump fan. But if we did not care about the law or morality, his comment that we would respond to terrorist attacks by killing the friends and relatives of the terrorists was right on, because that's something they would care about. And if they thought, if I blow myself up for my cause, all of my relatives will die, that would be a factor. But obviously, we're not going to do those things because we're not like that. But what we ought to be doing, it seems to me, is trying to assess the potential threats and what they care about, what they value, what they fear, and persuade them in advance that if they engage in a biological threat or any other kind of terrorism, we need to convince them that when all of the smoke is cleared, no matter how much damage they do, in the end, the things they believe in will be worse off than they were in the beginning. We've had American terrorists go to churches and murder people. We've had bombings. We've had all sorts of things. There are countries in the Middle East that would love to and do attack Israel. And if we could convince them that if they attack a black church or a Jewish synagogue or Israel, that the world community is going to unite, and in the end, their targets and the causes their targets represent are going to be much better off than they were beforehand. You fire a missile into Israel, and the world community is going to greatly increase Israel's defense budget. Again, even terrorists can make rational decisions. They may have different perceptions of what's important and so forth, but there are reasons they do these things. And I think we need to be understanding, first of all, that these things are done by individuals. They may lead organizations, but decisions are not made by groups as often as they're made by individuals. And those individuals have values, interests, and so forth. And the more we can work to understand them and to persuade them that it is not in their interest, short or long term, to engage in this type of behavior, the more likely we are to deter them. But beyond that, the only other thing, I was looking through a January 2018 report that the International Center for Terrorism Studies did, and you talk of, this was a time when most Americans were not thinking about pandemics. But Yonah Alexander concluded his opening remarks. In sum, the globalization of pandemic outbreaks of deadly infectious diseases are only a matter of time. Well, that time has come. We've seen it. It has incentivized some bad guys to want to play in this area because they see how destructive it can be. Hopefully, it will incentivize the good guys to understand the threat and to work together to try to find solutions. And I don't know of a better comparable group than the sponsors of this group to take on that role. And I very much hope that the end product of this, the video and also the publication, will get very wide readership around the country and the world.
Thank you very much, Bob. We really appreciate your comments. I think many of the views that you expressed on the counterterrorism strategy, I think we have to come back to it. Let me ask our colleague, Nick Rostow, Dr. Rostow, to make some comments initially, then we'll open it up for discussion with our speakers and commentators and hopefully the audience. So again, Nick, in the interest of time, I think everyone right here on the panel is aware of your many contributions over the years. Again, as a scholar, historian, and academic and lawyer and advisor to the political, I think, goal of this country, some of the presidents of national security affairs. And I recall, many times when we met, different occasions, for example, in Albany, New York, at the time when you served as the University Council Vice Chancellor on legal affairs, and also many of our events over the years. So can you, Nick, jump in and try to provide some insights to our discussion.
Thank you, Yona and Don. It's wonderful to be with this group again. You know, I realize our relationship goes back to 1985, if not earlier. So that's getting to be a long time ago. As to Bob Turner, I'll start at the end with Bob Turner's remarks. Reminded me of when I went to work for Abe Sofair in the summer of '85 and was sent off immediately to debate in upstate New York, an FBI agent on the administration's response to terrorism. And I was provided talking points, but of course, in the Reagan administration, you didn't need any talking points. The position was clear. They can run, but they can't hide, and we don't negotiate with them. And the FBI agent, of course, got up and said, well, of course we negotiate with them and encourage families of victims who've been kidnapped in South America to pay ransom to get their, it was a very infuriating but enlightening moment. I think there are just a couple of things I'd like to pick up on, because I think they're common themes of the remarks of everyone who's spoken before me. One is the tremendous need for process. And bring all the layers of government at the national level, state, local, federal, together to work pandemic preparedness. And process goes beyond national borders. One of the things that was severely lacking, at least in the public, as far as the public was concerned, was international cooperation. And it wasn't evident that the United States was cooperating and working with its friends and allies, much less through agencies at the UN. And of course, working through the UN has its frustrations and limitations, and you need a lot of imagination. And that's why Abe Sofair's idea, I think, is so attractive, to try and take the national security dimension out to the extent it's possible to do so that agencies, international agencies, can work more effectively. But I think part of the legal strategy has to be process. And I just think it's what one of the lessons learned from the response to COVID-19 has to be the need for enhanced process. The second problem, which is the 800-pound gorilla in the room, is the COVID exacerbation of the US political parties throwing up their hands in front of budget deficits. We haven't had a serious response to budgetary questions in decades. It's as if both parties have said, well, we don't know what to do about them, so we're going to say they don't matter. And now they're COVID, as one friend of mine wrote an article called The Great Disappearing Superpower, about how the cost of the pandemic had essentially eliminated the United States as a superpower, just bankrupted it. And I don't know whether we're going to stay, whether that's going to prove to be the case, but it's a serious question in my mind. And it's going to mean that the resources available for combating transnational health problems like the coronavirus, much less more conventional problems, we're going to come up against resource shortages. And then the final point I'd like to make is where Rita Caldwell began with a sort of passing reference to attack. Well, maybe it was Jennifer Buss on past reference to the Florida water supply. One of the things that I've always thought we were incredibly lucky about is that our nuclear weapons systems are not computerized, and the New York City water supply is not computerized, and therefore they're not vulnerable to computer attack. But it sounds as if Florida isn't so lucky, and those who want to modernize our nuclear weapons arsenal probably want to do it with computers. And the protocols for computers were not designed with security in mind, and therefore they're all very vulnerable. And so I just wanted to flag that point because I think it's relevant also in the area of biological health threats. I'll avoid getting into whether or not the COVID was a Chinese weapon that escaped a lab. I was in the government, as Abe was, when Sverdlovsk happened, which was a Soviet anthrax weapon that escaped, as it were, into the atmosphere and killed at least 10,000 people, if not more. Process is, in my view, essential to getting anywhere in national and international pandemic preparedness, which is essential if we're going to meet the next pandemic with greater success than we met this one. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Okay, Nick, thank you very much for your comments, and we would like to come back to some and perhaps to invite our colleagues on the program to jump in. We covered some, of course, issues, some of the interdisciplinary and the international cooperation and diplomacy and the legal approach. There are obviously some other areas to consider in terms of the role of communication, persuasion, the role of the media, social media, and the role of education, etc., etc. I wonder whether we can come back. I don't know, is Jennifer, are you still there? Maybe she left. Don, anytime, of course, if you want to jump in now, anytime.
I think some of you, I think I'm on. Bob and the others know that these panels become richer and richer and cover more and more ground. Rita has inspired us for really this year. I don't think she ever knew she'd be falling in with so many non-scientists who, of course, have views about science. We can't talk about everything. I would like to just pick up a little bit of what Abe said. You know, why is there not more enthusiasm for international solutions? I think the answer is, because America fell by the wayside. So certainly in our own, and why have we fallen by the wayside? Putting to one side politics, I think we've gotten tired. I think we've gotten too sophisticated. I mean, we were driven by idealism, actually by innocence, as we came out of World War II, and that was probably the engine which drove the world. Can we come back? Nick was talking about costs. I think not only can we must, and I think we will. There's no alternative. The question of how you deal with China and Russia, well, we'll see how we deal with China and Russia. I think we just have to keep our eye on the ball, engage, and drive forward. I thought that, and of course, then one has to, Jennifer, I'm sorry she's not here, one has to be specific. But, you know, we're talking at the global level where Abe was specific, even though he's talking about a regime that doesn't exist yet. He was describing what it should include or might include and what it should not. I think we have to restore our faith in ourselves. I think we have it. and I think we'll go forward. And I, like Bob, was not a very, I think probably none of us was an admirer of the last chief executive. And I think the worst thing is that he led many of us to question our own ability to, America's capacity and ability to move forward. But I think it's much bigger than any individual. This is a country with enormous moxie, drive, individualism, individuals. John talked about public-private partnerships with respect to a particular aspect. I think this is going to happen, and we just have to do it. And you know, to tell the old joke that is endlessly told now about the discussion between Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai, when, you know, Kissinger asked Zhou Enlai, "What do you think about the French Revolution?" And he says, "It's too early to tell." Well, it's surely too early to tell what it would be like in 2 or 3 years from now. And I think it'll be profoundly different in mood, and we will have to tackle these issues, and then we'll have to prioritize, as one always has to do. And there are many people who specialize in how you prioritize when you have many problems and many possible solutions. You know, as my daughter once said, you can either be an optimist or a pessimist. And I think we have to be optimists, and I think with reason. Yona?
Yes,
So that's my comment.
that's your comment.
That's it. That's my comment.
I see. Okay, that's great. Anyone else on the program? Rita, are you still there?
Yes, but I'm going to have to jump off because I have another lecture to give.
Okay.
But it's great. I've really enjoyed this. Every time I join this group, I learn a whole lot more, and it's really fascinating. Scary, but it's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you very much for taking the time to join us again. Is John there? John Norton?
You know, let me say something, because I think John's comment was inspiring, really. And it reflects what George Shultz always said. You prepare things like planting seeds in a garden, and you cultivate the garden, and you wait for the time when you have an opportunity. If you're a great country, as we are, we have an opportunity to implement an idea. And I don't mean to, when I say that we shouldn't be focused on the biological weapons convention if we want to create a legal regime, it's not because I don't think we should focus on biological weapons or chemical weapons. It's because I think that if you have a regime that is going to be legally enforceable, states are much more likely to adopt it if you're not talking about their weapons. And in fact, as Rita's pointed out in her papers, the issue of responsibility for a biological event is really less important when you're really trying to protect the people of the world and of America than it is in the area of weapons and national security. So that's why I thought one of the first step is what Don said. You got to get America on board. We got to be pushing for these changes. Second step is, you know, if you're talking about biothreats and dealing with their consequences without regard to responsibility as such, the best way to do it is to set aside the national security dimension and then start looking for legal enforcement. So I think Don's comments were absolutely on point, that we have to start talking about these things now, because there'll be an opportunity, and it's coming soon, I think, where we will be able to go back into business internationally.
You know, Yona, let me say something picking up on Abe, and Nick in particular spent time at the UN. Abe referred to the UN. We have a tendency to look down on it with some reason. On the other hand, it's in town. It's a game in town. It's one that the Russians and the Chinese like. And it's probably one place where we have many more, in spite of everything. I've been a delegate to the UN for over 40 years in technical legal areas, where we have a lot of support if we seek it. And in the last few years, I think we've just basically hidden our light under a bushel. We're weak, we're just not vigorous, we're not daring. There's no reason we can't be. And when we are daring, I think Abe is correct, that people around the world are not all enemies by any means. A lot of them are muddled, they're confused, they're weak. They certainly look up to us. Most of them are disappointed by us. And you have to pick those areas, pushing as hard as you can. And I agree, weapons is something else. Health, everyone is worried about their health, for God's sake. And we, this country, is the source of more solutions to health problems, probably than any nation in history times two. I mean, my wife's a Brit, and the Brits have been good in science, but America, and where have these vaccines come from? Of course, they come from years of research, I understand. So, I mean, we just have to run with this. And back to Bob's point, Bob Turner, and actually Nick's, I mean, yes, we could bankrupt ourselves, but I'd rather be enthusiastic and lose a little bit of money than not be enthusiastic and let the world just drift on as it's drifting, as it has been drifting clearly, and drifting in a rather unhealthy, if I may use that word, direction.
Well, we can certainly continue to discuss some of these aspects, but then again, you know, we spoke about the UN, and obviously we know that there are some regional organizations. Of course, the role of NATO in this area, or the role of the EU, or the Asians and Latin Americans and Africans and so on. Everyone seems to be concerned about this, but the question is how we can bring them together. Abe had some very useful practical approaches, so we certainly have to move on that. But then again, I really don't think that we can resolve the issue, the challenge at this point, unless we try to move also out of the box and involve the public as well, meaning to restore the confidence of people in the government's role and to participate, not only as observers, but participants. And that's why I think we have to invest also in the field of education to train the next generation of public officials and scientists and teachers and dreamers and so on and so forth. So I don't know if there are any other people. Maria, would you like to jump in at this point?
Thank you, Professor. I would just like to thank all the speakers for the conclusions. I just wanted to mention that also at the national level, there are several initiatives like the Global Health Security Agenda. So that is also a forum for collaboration of some member states of the UN. This was led by the US when it was established. So that is a good platform for cooperation. And there are some packages of work led by different countries. So there is work going on in that forum. And there is another forum for cooperation that is the Global Partnership Against the Spread of Weapons and Materials of Mass Destruction that was originally created by Canada, but it's within the framework of the G7. And there is a lot of work and coordination being done in that group as well, particularly in programming on all these issues. So countries are coming together to work on different of these aspects, even if the BWC is not providing like a big, let's say, forum for counterterrorism issues, but you know, there are different aspects that are being discussed by member states in other forums. And yeah, so just wanted to bring to the attention that even if this is not UN, countries came together to where they were aware of this threat and put together some actions. So there are also networks on biotechnology, synthetic biology from scientists. So there are things going on. I can also share some contacts with you on all these networks, and perhaps you can get more information from them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. Anyone else at this point?
Just one quick comment. I loved what Don said, his whole presentation. But we have a problem. Most of us who grew up, I was born during World War II, we grew up with a tremendous love for this country. And as I look around today, our schools are producing people that don't like America, that don't want America to play a leading role because they think what we do is bad. And I think, I don't know the answer to that, but if we're going to keep doing good, we're going to have to address that issue and try to make sure that young Americans understand how really incredibly good this country has been. And again, I toss it out. I don't have an answer for it.
That's right, Alexander. We do have one question from the participants, if you have a moment.
Yes, sure.
Okay. This is from Professor Carpentino Santa Maria from the Institute of Nuclear Fission, IFN. And her question is for Professor Safar. How would it be possible to establish an international law to agree in having a common policy to face crisis as the one we are globally undergoing with COVID-19? And I will just make a parenthetical personal statement. I believe that the WHO has offered a all-of-government treaty. I think there might be 23 possible signatories to that. I'm not sure if that aligns with this question, but if you want to take that into consideration as well.
I think the all-of-government idea is a great one, and it's basically a national initiative. The idea of every government would marshal all its resources, but specifically with regard to what the WHO could have done regarding, say, COVID-19, and if it had the authorities that I've suggested that we consider giving them. It would start with their capacity to intervene in Wuhan and determine the facts, and China's responsibility to report the facts accurately and specifically. Now, in that regard, it's interesting to note that it wasn't the Chinese state that interfered with the full revelation of the facts, immediate revelation. It was the local Communist Party membership leaders who did not want to be embarrassed by revealing these things. So it's very important that you work through national agencies and get them on your side, even though you may have a legal basis for requiring cooperation and information. So that would be the first step. The second step would be that there would be procedures in place to keep people from flying out of such areas and infecting the rest of the world. I think there should have been a shutdown immediately, not just for the US from China, but for the world from China. And the people who went to Italy, for example, from China and came back to the US and infected us, were doing as great a disservice as anyone could. And then third, the issue of preparedness in terms of having materials in place. These are things that, if they're mandated, you are much more likely to have them than if they're just, oh, wouldn't it be nice? Because we've been saying, wouldn't it be nice for many, many years. Ever since I came to Hoover, which was 26 years ago, I remember a conference about health threats within the US. And we talked about all kinds of issues about coordinating data information. All these things are well-known ideas. If you don't have them mandated, if you don't have them put into a procedural structure, as Nick pointed out, you just don't get them performed in the way you do if you have them in a structure. Of course, it's not going to be perfect. There's going to be a lot of hullabaloo when you're dealing with the UN. There always is. And we just have to we know how to do that. We handle that. We know how to, you know, the most recent one I heard was that vaccines are a global good. Vaccines are a global good. It doesn't matter who made them. It doesn't matter who paid for them. They're a global good. Okay, well, you know, I think they are a global good if you're talking about in a moral sense, in a sense that we need to prepare to get those vaccines out to everybody as soon as possible. But they're not a global good in the sense of everyone owns them. They're owned by a patent owner, maybe a couple of companies that created them. And the government that paid for their development has got something to say about them. So that's the kind of issue we're all familiar with. When you're dealing with the UN, that's the kind of issue that arises. And you got to say in your heart, well, the people who said that really care about people. And I remember that. And as senseless in terms of actually getting something done, as that kind of a statement may be, we should absorb that and take the good out of it and move on and protect our patent owners and at the same time be as active as we can in protecting the global health. So I hope that helps.
Right. Obviously, we can continue to discuss different lessons. Again, on a personal, professional level, I recall for years the work of the ICRC dealing not only with protecting the victims of war, but also moving into protecting the victims during peacetime. So I recall that we had for maybe two decades seminars and meetings in Geneva dealing with some of these issues to actually broaden, I think, the challenges, not only in times of war, but in times of peace. And it takes a great deal of education and communication. Hopefully we can focus on some of these issues in the coming weeks and months. I think we're planning to have an event later in April, at the end of April, perhaps on the issue of communication and the role of the media and social media and so forth. So we'll try to keep in touch with you. And at this point, I guess, Don Wallace, do you want to conclude our discussion?
Well, if I knew Latin, I would say goodbye in Latin, but I don't, so I just think I'll just say goodbye and thank everyone. You know, Yona never lets go, Nick, right? And
well, thank you for including me. It's great to see you all.
Great program, really well done.